Faint tracks at the edge of seaweed and sand, the telltale signs of the Hai-uri near a Khoikhoi encampment. On the wind-swept stretches where the sand meets the cold Atlantic and the scrub of Finbo's thrums under a pale sun, the elders of a Khoikhoi settlement still speak of the Hai-uri in low voices. They shape the name as you might trace a bone in the earth, careful, reverent, uncertain. The Hai-uri is no ordinary spirit. It stands on the liminal edge, half human in the way it thinks and remembers, half animal in its gestures and hunger. When the sea is low and the wind has stripped the kelp bare, the tracks that appear along the shoreline are not fully those of man nor beast, rounded human toes followed by a clawed drag, the impression of a woven garment next to a patch of matted fur. In these signs the old people read cautions: a fertility season to be guarded, a caravan to be watched, a newborn to be sheltered. Yet the creature is not merely a warning, it is a mirror of a community's fears and its unresolved debts to the land. This tale is not a simple scare story told at night. It is a map of memory. It seeks the cause of misfortune, the lineage of sorrow, and the stubborn tenderness that sometimes answers it. As much as the Hai-uri is the monster who arrives when the tide steals more than shells, it is also the symptom of what happens when people and land lose the rituals that hold them together. Through storms, hearth talks, shipwrecks, and the crooked paths of youthful curiosity, this story follows those who must decide whether the Hai-uri is to be driven away by song and bone, appeased with offerings, or understood and, if possible, reconciled. First encounters. Tracks, tales, and the breach in ritual. The first time the people spoke of misfortune tied to the Hai-uri, it was after a season of shriveling rain and a string of unlucky harvests. The cattle had returned thin from grazing, and pots of milk had soured overnight. At dawn a woman on the dunes, she belonged to the clan who tended the southern pastures, followed a set of tracks that stopped at a shallow cove. She found a child's toy, half buried, a bead-threaded figure, charred on one side. When she returned with the bead in her palm, the elders gathered beneath the sheltering roof of heaped brush and began the long speech of elders, how the name of the Hai-uri arrives in nights when balance falters, when taboos loosen, or when a promise to the sea is left unpaid. They lit a low, bitter-smelling incense of fumigated herbs and told the cautionary stories of their parents' parents. These were not merely spooky tales for children but oral laws encoded into narrative form. They explained that some forces do not answer to reason, they answer to reciprocity. An elder bends to trace the strange tracks left at dawn, a ritual act that ties story to land. For a long while, their stories used the language of boundaries. The Hai-uri came where exchange had been disrupted, a wound in the bargain between human and sea, man and beast. Once, fishermen had dropped a net with a hole in it and let the injured fish drift ashore, small slights that accumulate. Once, a trader left a piece of cloth, dyed by the river, tugged into the reeds rather than returned as thanks. The older stories say the Hai-uri is drawn to such breaches not because it wants revenge, but because it is a living record of failed covenants, it remembers the debts. Its half-human face remembers the name of the person who cheated, its animal body remembers the salt on the wind and the hunger it tasted when a carcass was left unburied. The villagers believed that with the right songs and offerings the imbalance could be corrected, or else the Hai-uri would make misfortune tangible. As the seasons wore on, the encounters multiplied. Children would wake with lacerations that stung like pinpricks, chickens disappeared into the night with tufts of feathers left like confessions, old dogs grew skittish and howled toward the rocks for no evident reason. But the signs that haunted the people most were the tracks, those hybrid prints that made the hair rise on the nape of the neck. The elders taught rituals meant to repair the world, the careful washing of tools used at sea, the return of a shard to a place of origin, the beating of drums at dusk at the edge of the dunes to wake the spirits and remind them of their due. When the rituals were observed, the village slept with an alert calm. The uneasy things remained at bay. When the rituals were neglected, the Hai-uri seemed to arrive with a different appetite. No one in the settlement ever claimed to have seen the creature in full light. Those who spoke of face-to-face encounters did so in stories that blurred the line between dream and waking. A hunter passing a lone rock at midnight who saw a shape leaning like a wind-stunted tree, who swore later his hands trembled at the remembering of eyes that were both too human in sorrow and too animal in their glitter. Many suggested the creature wore pieces of narratives like garments, a strip of cloth, a child's bead, a piece of shell, all the small fragments of human life it had gathered. The Hai-uri's voice, when it came, sounded like the overlapping memory of someone who knew both lullabies and the low guttural cries of beasts. In telling these tales, the people were not simply recounting horror, they were rehearsing a moral geometry, that neglect of reciprocity erodes the boundaries that protect a people from raw misfortune. This belief in the Hai-uri's appetite for imbalance guided both fear and action. It produced a kind of communal vigilance, watchmen at the reefs, frequent returns of lost offerings, and an insistence that no objects taken from a certain place be traded without ritual apology. Travelers passing through learned quickly to hedge their movements, never cut a strand of seaweed without a quiet word, never take home a tooth of a stranded seal without first leaving a small gift. Over time, these practices tied the people to a pattern of repair. A community that kept its rituals healed small slights before they swelled into calamity. Yet there were those who tested the story's edge, youth who found thrill in near misses or merchants who valued gold more than a vow. These transgressions tempted the Hai-uri as a moth flutters toward light. And that is how the creature's name spread across the dunes and into the sand tracks that mark the lives of those who claim the shoreline. But beyond the immediate fear of misfortune, a more complex understanding of the Hai-uri emerged in the mouths of storytellers. Some elders suggested that the creature had been born of a breach between cultures, an uncomfortable hybrid spawned by the collision of different ways of naming the world. When strangers arrived with bright bits of metal and new words for old territories, old obligations could slacken. The Hai-uri's half-human half-animal contours, in these accounts, were not only a source of dread but also an embodiment of change, a living topology of that friction. Stories handed down with patient cadence held within them the memory of how to reweave a torn web of obligations, whether to the sea, to the land, or to one another. In practice, these stories were the people's legal code. They taught how to apologize to the bay for a burned offering, to show a child the correct way to leave a shell, and to press a finger to a scar that the past would not let hide. In those ways, the tale of the Hai-uri became less a single monster story and more a sustained conversation about communal survival and the consequences of forgetting to keep agreements with the world around you. Unraveling the Hai-uri, offerings, reckoning, and a youth's reckless road. When the drought of one year stretched into another, and the well bore hairline cracks of salt, a young man named Cone grew restive. He was clever and impatient. In his hands, nets that should have mended did not hold. In his mind, the elders' reiterated cautions sounded like the grinding of an old millstone. Cone had heard the tales of the Hai-uri since he was small. He had felt the weight of those stories, how they cut off easy routes to profit and how they insisted on time spent in ritual. He wanted instead to know the creature by name and not by rumor. He decided, without ceremony or counsel, to follow the tracks that had become more frequent along the northern shore. A tense evening where a young man returns the items he took, ritualizing apology in the creature's presence. The first night Cone walked the dunes he was accompanied by a thin moon and the high hiss of surf. He moved with impatience, each step a question. The tracks led him past rock pools lit by the phosphorescent scrape of small mollusks, past the place where kelp formed dark teeth on the sand, to a stub of cliff where gulls nesting in crag hollows threw back their heads and vocalized like dry wood. There, in a shallow cave, Cone found evidence both ordinary and odd: a child's leather thong, a necklace of glass beads arranged in a pattern that echoed the sunrise, and a tuft of coarse fur. These things he pocketed with the secret excitement of someone who believed discovering was akin to owning. But as he rose to leave the cave, the air around him tightened. The hairs on his neck prickled in a cadence he had never felt. For a heartbeat, something stood at the cave mouth, not fully visible in the moonlight but present enough that Cone's knees remembered a lesson his mind had not been taught, that some watchfulness cannot be outrun. In the days after, misfortunes followed in small, brutal succession. Cone's father's sheep aborted unexpectedly. A fire broke out in the hut where Cone had left a handful of tobacco unwatched. A neighbor slipped into a fever that tugged at his breathing. The elders gathered, laid the patterns of cause and effect across the table of their concern, and suggested remedy. They urged Cone to return what he'd taken, to hold a day of atonement, to wade into the shallows at high tide and whisper apology to the sea. Cone, stubborn and flush with youthful certainty, refused the symbolic humility. He said he had found those things abandoned, the world offered them for the taking. He argued that the Hai-uri was an excuse used by less enterprising folk to explain what could be explained by hunger and luck. His resistance, however, felt less like principle than the brittle endurance of a man who'd not yet learned how to read the ledger of community obligations. The tale of Cone's refusal travels the way small misfortunes do, it grows in the telling. He would insist he had not stolen. They would counter that the Hai-uri consumes the memory of theft whether theft occurred or not, it turns a lapse into a scar. The old women pulled at his sleeve and sang a song to call back what had been loosened, a chant woven of names and the scent of roasted herbs, and told him the stories of ancestors who'd handled similar trespasses. They told of a youth who had returned a ring to the cliff and of a woman who walked the reef with a dish of milk until the tide took it as an answer. The rituals, they said, are pragmatic more than superstitious, they reassert the social bond. Kohn's testing of the story brought a kind of stubborn clarity, though he wouldn't see it for years. The Hai-uri, in a sense, is not solely a being of vengeance but a creature that forces reckoning. Some who have encountered it at the edge of sleeping find themselves remembering names they'd been hiding, debts they'd been minimizing. Others find, like Kohn, that the creature's arrival accelerates consequences that were always headed toward them. When Kohn finally relented, after a child in the village grew dangerously ill and the guilt weighed on him like a wet shawl, his apology was public. It was not the dramatic grand return one reads in fables, it was a halting, everyday act. He walked to the cave and left the returned accoutrements, arranged simply in the sand, and spoke aloud the name of the person he had wronged in the marketplace. He also learned to sit with the elders when they drummed at dusk and to help fetch water for the ritual fires. The community's rituals are never merely about objects, they are about the repetition that knits a world back together. From that moment the small, grim events in Kohn's life steadied into a pattern that leaned again toward repair. Yet the Hai-uri did not immediately vanish. It is stubborn because it is not merely offended, it is an archive. Over the years, as Kohn grew into the slow work of care, he came to understand the creature's place in the community's moral economy. It was a sentinel, yes, but also a cautionary symbol for a people who relied on an intimate set of exchanges with the land and sea. In one telling, Kohn would later recount a dream. He found himself shoulder to shoulder with the Hai-uri on the shore, and where its face would have been, he saw instead a mirror of his own hands, calloused, uncertain, willing finally to make offerings without counting value. He woke from this dream with a profound smallness. Such moments, intimate and strange, are how a community's metaphors alter from simple terror to instruments of transformation. The Hai-uri remains in the story not merely to frighten but to instruct, to teach that the boundary between human error and cosmic consequence is a fragile one, and that the only durable remedy is the steady labor of return. Beyond Kohn's individual arc, the unrest associated with the Hai-uri fed a larger conversation about change. When merchants passed through with bright beads and new goods, or when distant powers sent shiny flags that confused old loyalties, the practices that once guarded against misfortune frayed. The elders argued that the Hai-uri will only grow hungrier when the obligations that sustained reciprocity loosen. And so the tale, as retold by village storytellers, began to serve another function, to remind the young that myths are not frozen relics but adaptive instructions. To respect an old story is to consent to a common code of living. In that way the Hai-uri becomes, paradoxically, both a monster and a mechanism, a monstrous tutor teaching a people how to stay alive in a shifting world.